Prince Harry had once believed he was living inside a dream, a fairy tale spun out of centuries of tradition and gilded palaces, where every ceremony shimmered with pageantry and every photograph carried the weight of history. From the moment of his birth, his arrival had been heralded as the continuation of a dynasty, the little boy who captured the imagination of a nation still mourning the wounds of the past. To the public, he was not just a child. He was a symbol of resilience, the son of Diana, the people's princess, who had redefined what it meant to be royal. To Harry himself, it felt like both an inheritance and a burden. His early years were wrapped in privilege, yet overshadowed by grief that never fully loosened its grip. The boy who once smiled shyly from palace balconies grew into a man whose private pain rarely matched the dazzling photographs splashed across glossy covers. And slowly, the dream began to blur at the edges, revealing fractures that would widen with time. In those younger days, Harry imagined that destiny might offer him both freedom and purpose. He believed, perhaps naively, that he could forge a path where duty and individuality might coexist. Military service gave him a glimpse of that possibility. For the first time, he was judged not for his surname, but for his actions in uniform, for his grit under pressure, for the way he laughed with comrades who forgot to bow and instead treated him like one of their own. Those years were intoxicating because they gave him an identity stripped of palaces, tabloids, and ceremony. It was there, under desert skies and in the silence of a cockpit, that Harry felt the dream might be real. The dream of living with purpose, with honor, with camaraderie rather than isolation. But like all moments of escape in his life, it was fleeting. The monarchy waited for him back home, the cameras returned, and the weight of expectation pressed harder than ever. Then came Meghan, and with her, the intoxicating illusion that perhaps he could rewrite the script altogether. Love had always been the wild card the monarchy feared most, and for Harry, it was the force that promised liberation. With Meghan by his side, the dream sharpened into something vivid and radical, a life lived on his own terms, away from the rigid courtiers, away from the tabloid storms, away from the shadows of his mother's tragic fate. For a while, the fantasy seemed attainable. Their wedding was not just a royal spectacle. It was a cultural earthquake, watched by millions who saw in it the promise of a new monarchy, a blending of tradition and modernity, a symbol of progress wrapped in ancient ritual. The dream glowed brightest on that day when the choirs sang, the trumpets rang, and the world seemed to celebrate their union as though it were history bending towards something kinder. But dreams, no matter how golden, are fragile when tested against reality. Soon, the glow dimmed, replaced by headlines sharpened into knives. What Harry saw as a love story the world ought to embrace, much of the press treated as a spectacle to dismantle. Every gesture, every word, every silence between them was twisted into a narrative of scandal, discord, or betrayal. Harry's dream of shielding his wife from the fate that had consumed his mother became his obsession, and in pursuing it, he clashed not only with the press, but with the very institution he once called family. The royal household, steeped in centuries of tradition and secrecy, recoiled at his defiance. What Harry experienced as loyalty to his wife, they interpreted as rebellion against the crown. And the dream of harmony began to fracture into the nightmare of division. Their decision to leave Britain was painted as exile, though Harry framed it as liberation. California, with its sunshine and distance, promised a fresh chapter. They imagined sprawling gardens, the laughter of children safe from photographers' lenses, projects that spoke to their passions, and a freedom from the suffocating rituals of monarchy. But even as palm trees swayed and the Pacific glistened, reality whispered that freedom came with new battles. Without the shield of royal duty, they had to reinvent themselves in a world that no longer bowed automatically. They became entrepreneurs of their own image, signing deals with streaming giants and publishers, trading in stories and content that kept them relevant but also tethered them to the very fame they had once sought to escape. Each headline, each contract, each interview seemed to tighten the paradox. To step away from the monarchy, they had to speak endlessly of it. To find freedom, they had to keep the chains in view. For Harry, the tension was exhausting. He had imagined that California would silence the echoes of palace corridors, but instead the ghosts followed. Memories of his mother haunted him more vividly, especially as he told and retold her story, weaving it into books and documentaries. Each time he spoke of the past, the wounds tore open afresh. And each time he tried to defend his wife from criticism, he found himself dragged deeper into a cycle of anger and disillusionment. What was supposed to be a dream of healing began to resemble an endless reckoning, where peace always hovered just out of reach. The public, too, proved unpredictable. Where once they had cheered his wedding and sympathized with his struggles, now they seemed divided, weary of the drama that followed him like a shadow. Admirers praised his courage to stand against centuries of power, but critics accused him of hypocrisy, of cashing in on the very system he condemned. In Britain, polls revealed plummeting popularity, and in America, where celebrity can be both crown and curse, he found that adoration could sour overnight. The boy who had once been a beloved prince became, in some corners, a figure of controversy, mocked or dismissed rather than revered. And so the dream continued to unravel, thread by thread, until Harry himself began to wonder whether he had ever truly understood what freedom meant. Nightmares took many forms. Sleepless nights haunted by the paparazzi's flashbulbs, strained calls with family members who spoke more through lawyers than through love, business ventures that faltered under scrutiny, and the gnawing fear that the fairy tale he had built for his children might collapse before their eyes. He had hoped to create a sanctuary for them, far from the palaces and their burdens, but instead found that the storms of fame and resentment raged even across oceans. In quiet moments, Harry still dreamed. He dreamed of a life where he could walk unnoticed on a beach, where his children could laugh in playgrounds without whispers, where his marriage was not dissected as a headline, but lived as a truth. Yet those dreams often dissolved by morning, replaced with the sharp reality that every step he took was monitored, judged, or monetized. And in the silent spaces between those realizations, the question pressed hardest. Had his pursuit of freedom only built a different kind of prison? If Harry sometimes closed his eyes and tried to rewind, he could almost hear the applause of crowds that once adored him without condition. He remembered the days when children waved Union Jack flags, when the press hailed him as the fun-loving prince who brought warmth to an otherwise solemn institution, when he was the spare who could laugh, drink, misstep, and still be forgiven because William bore the heavier crown of destiny. That nostalgia was dangerous, because it reminded him of the simplicity of being liked without question. Now, every smile was scrutinized, every silence interpreted as sulk, every appearance measured against narratives of betrayal or bitterness. The warmth of a nation had cooled, and the silence that replaced it was more chilling than the noise of criticism. It was as though the dream had flipped on itself, becoming a nightmare where he was trapped in a hall of mirrors, every reflection distorted, every path leading back to the same accusations. In California, the sunshine was relentless, but Harry felt shadows everywhere. Montecito gave him the privacy he thought he craved, with high hedges and gated drives, yet the isolation was its own punishment. Palaces had once bound him, but they also bustled with movement, with staff, with tradition, with duty that filled the hours whether he wanted it or not. Now, in sprawling stillness, he was left to his thoughts. Meghan worked tirelessly. Their projects demanded meetings and strategies, but the emptiness between obligations lingered. He filled it with therapy, with interviews, with writing, with speaking tours where his voice trembled between conviction and confession. He told the world of his trauma, of his fractured family, of his anger at tabloids, of his fear for his children. Each revelation felt cathartic in the moment, but afterward, he sometimes felt as though he had handed another piece of himself to the very machine he despised. The deals that once promised stability soon carried their own weight. Netflix expected content, Spotify wanted podcasts, publishers demanded stories. At first, there was enthusiasm, an eagerness to share their truth, to reshape their image. But as deadlines loomed, pressure mounted, and creative visions clashed with commercial demands, the dream of being free creators threatened to turn into another treadmill of obligation. When critics panned a project, or numbers disappointed, Harry could feel the world smirking at his failure. He had once been shielded from such direct accountability. Now, He was just another figure in an industry where relevance was currency and criticism was ruthless. The nightmare was not merely that he was judged, but that he was judged without the safety net of monarchy. And then, there were the silences from across the Atlantic. Family ties had frayed to the thinnest of threads. Calls with his father. The interviews, meant to reclaim his narrative, sometimes felt like confessions without absolution. He would sit across from seasoned hosts, articulate his grievances, explain his motivations, and bare his soul with a vulnerability he once thought unimaginable. For a few moments, he felt relief, as though truth spoken aloud would transform public opinion. But once the cameras stopped, he often felt emptier than before. Critics accused him of whining, of airing dirty laundry, of weaponizing pain for profit. Admirers defended his courage, insisting he was exposing outdated institutions to much-needed scrutiny. Yet in both camps, Harry realized he remained trapped in the role of spectacle. His truth, once spoken, was no longer his. It belonged to the world, twisted and reframed to suit agendas that had nothing to do with him. Meghan, strong and resilient in public, sometimes shared his weariness in private. She reminded him why they had chosen this path, why silence had been more dangerous than speech, why protecting their children justified every sacrifice. Her determination steadied him, but he saw the toll in her eyes, too. The exhaustion of endless scrutiny, the frustration of being misunderstood, the loneliness of being cut off from what should have been family. Their love remained their fortress, but even fortresses can feel claustrophobic when constantly under siege. In quiet moments, Harry wondered whether his dream of liberation had become her burden as much as his own. The British press continued to haunt him, oceans away. Articles dissected his every project. Commentators framed him as petulant or misguided. Royal experts spoke of him as though he were a case study rather than a man. His memoir, written with raw honesty, had been intended as catharsis, a chance to tell his side of the story once and for all. Yet when it was released, its most intimate confessions became ammunition for mockery. Details he had included to humanize himself were lifted out of context and turned into memes, jokes on late-night television, bullet points for critics who claimed he had debased himself for sales. The dream of truth-telling had turned into the nightmare of self-exposure, leaving him vulnerable in ways he had not anticipated. Sometimes, Harry imagined what life might have been had he stayed. He pictured himself in Britain, standing beside William at official engagements, smiling for cameras, fulfilling roles with quiet dignity. In that version, there were no contracts with media companies, no late-night punchlines, no fractured family ties. Yet even in those daydreams, he felt suffocated, the old wounds reopening, the constant fear of history repeating itself with Meghan and their children. The truth was, there had never been an easy path, only two versions of compromise, each carrying its own shadows. What he longed for was not one life or the other, but something that existed in neither, a life free of calculation, free of performance, free of the burden of being a symbol. At public appearances in America, he was often greeted with warmth. Crowds cheered, charities welcomed his involvement, children beamed at him with unguarded excitement. Yet he could not help noticing the differences. The way admiration here felt fleeting, tied to celebrity rather than lineage. In Britain, reverence had been inherited, an unspoken contract between monarchy and people. In America, respect had to be earned anew each day, and it could vanish as quickly as it arrived. Harry respected that challenge, but it unnerved him, too. He had been raised in a world where relevance was permanent, secured by birthright. Now, relevance felt conditional, tied to output, to headlines, to projects that proved his worth. It was as though he had traded one gilded cage for another, this one invisible, but just as binding. The nightmares came most vividly in sleep. He dreamt of flashing cameras, of his mother's final night replaying in loops, of standing alone in echoing palace halls while voices accused him of betrayal. Sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, Meghan beside him, whispering reassurances he barely believed. Therapy helped, but trauma does not vanish with words. It lingers, reshaping itself into new forms, reminding him that escape was never so simple. Even in California, he could feel London's streets beneath his feet, could hear the bells of Westminster, could taste the bitterness of loss. Harry's inner circle had shrunk. Trust was currency he spent sparingly, burned too many times by betrayal and leaks. Old friends in Britain drifted away, either wary of the drama or quietly resentful of his choices. New acquaintances in America offered companionship, but rarely history, the kind of shared memories that root a friendship deep. He often felt suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, a man without a home in the truest sense. The nightmare was not just public judgment, but private loneliness, the hollow ache of knowing that even as millions discussed him daily, few truly knew him. And yet, there were moments, brief, fleeting, when the dream still flickered. Watching his children play beneath California skies, holding Meghan's hand during quiet walks, feeling the ocean wind cut through heavy thoughts, Harry sensed the outlines of the life he had sought. It was not perfect, not without scars, but it was real. He clung to those moments fiercely, because they reminded him why he had chosen this path at all. Still, the nightmare always lurked nearby, whispering doubts, echoing failures, reminding him that peace was fragile and dreams could curdle into burdens overnight. Time moved differently now. In Britain, his life had been measured in ceremonies and duties, anniversaries and commemorations. In California, the calendar was filled with deadlines, production schedules, negotiations. Neither world allowed stillness, neither permitted invisibility. The irony weighed heavily. The prince who had fled for freedom found himself busier than ever defending, explaining, creating, proving. And in the quiet hours, when the children were asleep and Meghan was lost in thought, Harry sometimes admitted to himself that perhaps true freedom had never been possible for someone like him. Not as a prince, not as a celebrity, not as Diana's son. His name, his face, his story were etched into the world's imagination, and no amount of oceans or deals could wash that away. The dream had always been simple: to live a life defined by love, not duty, by truth, not performance, by healing, not hurt. But the nightmare was discovering how impossible that simplicity was in a world that refused to stop watching, dissecting, judging. And so Harry remained in between, walking a line where hope and disillusionment intertwined, where every triumph carried the shadow of scrutiny, where every dream seemed to edge closer, then dissolve into mist. As the years passed, Harry began to realize that the line between dream and nightmare was not sharp but blurred, an ever-shifting fog that he could never quite escape. What once felt like triumphs, stepping away from palace life, speaking openly of his struggles, building a new family home, began to feel like illusions that dissolved upon closer inspection. Freedom was not absolute, healing was not linear, and love, while steadfast, could not silence the roar of the world outside their gates. It was a sobering truth, one that left him staring at the California horizon with a heaviness he had not expected. The world continued to demand pieces of him. A charity event here, a documentary there, a memoir dissected until nothing remained sacred. He gave, and he gave, convinced that transparency would grant him peace. Yet the more he revealed, the less control he seemed to have over the story. He had left the palace to escape the machinery of image-making, only to find himself the operator of his own machine, one that required constant maintenance to stay alive in the public eye. The dream of telling his truth became the nightmare of never being allowed to stop telling it. There were days when Harry felt angry at fate itself. He had never asked to be born into royalty, never chosen the cameras, the titles, the expectations. He was a child when the world thrust him onto a stage, and now as a man he still felt trapped in a role he hadn't auditioned for. Even in rebellion, he remained defined by the crown he had left behind. He could not undo his bloodline, could not erase the boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin, could not silence the voice of critics who insisted he owed loyalty to an institution that had often failed him. The anger simmered quietly, turning at times into bitterness, at times into despair. Yet in rare, unguarded moments, he saw flashes of what his dream had always been. Archie's wide grin when he conquered a new game, Lilibet's tiny arms reaching up to him with unfiltered trust, Meghan's laughter when the world was momentarily forgotten. These were fragments of paradise. They reminded him that his pursuit had never been about palaces or popularity, but about building a sanctuary where love came first. Still, The sanctuary was fragile, constantly under siege from the outside. And Harry feared, deep down, that no fortress he built could fully withstand the storms that followed his name. The public perception shifted like sand. At times, he and Meghan were celebrated as visionaries breaking free from archaic chains, admired for daring to speak truths that institutions preferred to bury. At other times, they were mocked, dismissed as self-indulgent or opportunistic. Harry had grown used to the pendulum, but he had not grown numb. Every headline still stung, every sneer still cut. The dream of indifference, of truly not caring, remained out of reach. For all his bravado, Harry cared deeply, perhaps too deeply, about how the world saw him. And so the nightmare persisted, fueled not just by external voices, but by his own longing to be understood. At night, when the world quieted, Harry often imagined conversations that would never happen. He pictured sitting across from his brother, breaking the silence, rebuilding trust brick by brick. He imagined walking into a room with his father, hearing words of forgiveness that history had never allowed. He imagined, most painfully, what it would feel like to tell his mother that he had done his best, that every choice was made to honor her, even when it looked messy from the outside. These conversations lived only in his mind, yet they shaped him as much as the real ones did. They reminded him that the past was never truly past, that the dream of reconciliation still tugged at him even as the nightmare of estrangement grew colder. California nights could be deceptive. The stillness suggested peace, but Harry felt the hum of invisible currents around him. Fame, expectation, scrutiny, judgment, all swirling in the dark. He sometimes wondered if anyone born into royalty could ever escape its pull, or if the crown remained a kind of gravity that no distance could defy. He thought of his children, wondered what they would make of their heritage, whether they would carry it proudly or see it as a curse. He wanted to shield them from the mistakes of his youth, from the pain of constant exposure, but he knew he could not control the world forever. Perhaps that was the cruelest nightmare of all, that even as he fought to rewrite his story, he might be unable to protect theirs. And yet, for all the disillusionment, for all the weariness, Harry held on to fragments of hope. He had inherited his mother's stubborn heart, the refusal to surrender to forces that sought to define him. Even in nightmares, he sought meaning, believing that his struggles could illuminate truths for others, that his candor could inspire someone else to seek help, to break free, to survive. The dream was battered but not extinguished, flickering like a candle that refused to die even in the harshest wind. Harry knew, in his clearest moments, that he was not chasing a perfect life that had never been real. What he sought was balance, a place where dreams and nightmares coexisted without destroying him, where he could accept that his path would always be complicated but still worth walking. It was not the fairy tale the world once imagined for him, nor the quiet anonymity he sometimes longed for, but something in between, a life built on imperfection, resilience, and the stubborn belief that love could still anchor him through the storm. And so, the prince who had once dreamed of freedom now lived in the tension between hope and disillusionment, his days a constant negotiation between light and shadow. His story was not neat, not resolved, not free of contradiction. But perhaps that was the truth he had been searching for all along, that dreams and nightmares are not opposites, but mirrors of the same life, each shaping the other, each reminding him that he was still alive, still fighting, still searching for peace in a world that would never stop watching.